Harpreet, a fourth-year medical student at the University of Birmingham and a presenter here at the Aspiring Medics. Today we're going to go through 10 key NHS questions.
Station 1. Define what patient-centred care means to you as a future healthcare professional.
So to me, patient-centred care means having the patient at the forefront of your thoughts when it comes to making decisions regarding their healthcare. And there are several ways in which I can go about this as a future healthcare practitioner. First and foremost, having an individualistic approach to the patient's healthcare, making sure that I'm communicating in an effective way and ultimately empowering the patient to make their own decisions regarding their healthcare. Individualistic care means making sure to address all three different aspects of a patient's health, whether that be their biological, their psychological, or their social health, and making sure all their needs are addressed within these three domains and not overlooking any problems within these domains either. Additionally, patient-centred care also means communicating with the patient in a very effective way. There you're able to communicate all benefits or risks of a particular treatment, but also providing things such as a translator if the patient's first language isn't English. Additionally, effective communication also means being empathetic, really making sure that the patient feels heard, and avoiding medical jargon when talking to the patient as well. All of these empower the patient into being confident about the decisions that they're making regarding their healthcare, which improves overall patient outcomes. As a future healthcare practitioner, I see patient-centred care as a way to build rapport with the patient by building trust with the patient and ultimately allowing this to improve their overall satisfaction with the healthcare that they receive.
Station 2. Why might it be difficult to provide health and social care to the residents of this home?
So in this particular home, I can see that it's a single-storey cottage, a very old-looking cottage in the middle of nowhere. It looks like it's in a very rural area, and I can see several problems that may arise from this particular location that the resident might be faced with, such as accessibility to healthcare, infrastructure limitations, as well as staffing challenges. So in terms of accessibility to healthcare, since this cottage does appear to be in a very rural location, it might be very difficult for the resident to access healthcare services that might be in the town across, for example, or even for ambulance services to arrive to that location due to terrain. And this can delay the treatment that the patient receives or delay them going into the hospital for any other procedures, for example, which can worsen healthcare outcomes and lead to the patient's health deteriorating even more. Additionally, since the cottage does appear to be quite old, for example, there may be some problems regarding facilitating mobility aids inside the cottage, having stair lifts inside the cottage as well, and generally having room for other people to provide care for the resident, for example. And finally, there might also be issues surrounding staffing in nearby hospitals for the resident, for example. So since the cottage is very rural, chances are nearby staff who do work in the hospital also have to live quite far out, which can create challenges in recruiting and retaining potential staff members for the hospital as well. And this in turn can have a negative impact on the patient's health, as the quality and the consistency of care they receive wouldn't be as great as if they, for example, lived in a city. From my work experience, having worked in a small GP surgery in the countryside, I've definitely noticed that it's very hard for particularly the older patients to have access to, for example, pharmacies and secondary health care. So these kind of areas tend to be very far away from the villages and thus creates difficulties surrounding transportation.
Station 3. What rights do patients hold while in hospital or clinical settings?
So as soon as a patient enters a clinical setting, they have a lot of rights. The ones that I'll discuss today, they have the right to informed consent, the right to privacy and confidentiality, the right to be treated with dignity and respect, and finally the right to complain as well. So when we discuss the right to informed consent, that means that the healthcare provider in charge of their care has given them all the risks, the benefits, alternatives when it comes to different treatments, different procedures, and the patient makes decisions regarding them out of their own free will without having been swayed or coerced towards any particular decision. Additionally, patients also have the right to privacy and confidentiality, and this doesn't just mean making sure that the online data that's being held about them is encrypted. It also means that the paper notes that healthcare professionals make about them are anonymous, they don't have any patient identifying information on them, as well as things such as making sure any paper documents aren't left lying around, they're kept locked away, and any open computers, for example, on the wards are switched off when the healthcare professional isn't there. From my work experience, what I've seen is in the mornings during ward rounds, consultants and doctors make sure to pull the ward curtains around each of the patient's bed, again ensuring their dignity and privacy in the hospital too. This leads very nicely into the point of the patients also have the right to be treated with a lot of respect and a lot of dignity regardless of what background they come from, and this involves treating them the same way you would any other patient, making sure you're very empathetic with them, you communicate in the right way with them. The patient needs to feel valued and the patient also needs to feel heard, both when you're talking to the patient in front of their face, but also it's very important to be mindful when speaking about the patient behind their back, making sure that we're not making any comments or talking about them in a way that you wouldn't say in front of their face, for example. And finally, the patients have the right to complain when they feel as if the care that they're being given it doesn't match their expectations. So any complaints that they do raise need to be addressed appropriately in the right manner. They need to be addressed at the right time as well, and need to be escalated if the things aren't handled properly. So overall, patients have a lot of rights in the hospital, and it ties in very closely with the NHS's principle of delivering high quality care and the NHS principle of making sure you treat patients with a lot of respect and a lot of dignity.
Station 4. The NHS provides universal healthcare to all UK residents that is free at the point of delivery. What are the advantages and disadvantages of universal healthcare in the NHS?
So we're very lucky in the UK to have universal healthcare, which is free at the point of delivery, and this is done via the taxation of income by the government. And there are several advantages and disadvantages that come with universal healthcare. The main advantages being that it acts as a financial protection for people. With healthcare being free, we can intervene a lot earlier on before particular diseases. However, there are a lot of disadvantages which we're seeing in the news right now, which are to do with budget constraints as well as the very high demand for healthcare as well. The main advantage that comes with having universal healthcare is that we're able to give equitable, fair healthcare to people regardless of their background, their race and their religion. Additionally, since universal healthcare is free, patients are more likely to see doctors about things such as obesity, for example, which is linked to a lot of serious problems like diabetes and hypertension, and we're able to tackle these a lot earlier on, thus saving us further complications in the future, which can impact the patient in a much more negative way and can put a strain on resources a lot more as well. And finally, another big advantage of universal healthcare is that it acts as a financial protection for people who would have not been able to afford the healthcare if it was fully privatized, for example, such as in America, or if they had to pay for insurance like in Germany or in France as well. However, that being said, there are a lot of disadvantages that do come with universal healthcare. The main one being the very high demand for healthcare at the minute, which is due to, for example, things such as an aging population, the increased rate of chronic conditions that we're seeing that need a lot of treatments, that need more extensive management. And all of these put a very big strain on our budget, which means that we're unable to allocate resources for particular treatments, which if we had a larger pot of money, we would have been able to tackle them a lot better. So for example, there's currently a new medication out for Alzheimer's which can slow down the disease progression very well. However, due to budget constraints, the NHS is unable to fund that treatment due to the extensive monitoring it requires post having administered the drug. That's one example of how constraints can really affect treatments for individuals. From my work experience, when discussing this with my GP, I really noticed that there's this whole idea of a postcode lottery, which means that depending on which part of the UK you were born in, your access to particular healthcare can be quite limited. So we saw a patient who wanted to undergo IVF treatment, but thankfully our region was very well funded for this particular treatment and she was able to get that treatment. However, my GP practitioner mentioned that in some parts of the country which aren't very well funded, it's harder for patients to meet certain criteria and undergo treatments like IVF. So overall, I think the NHS being free at the point of delivery and being universal has a lot of disadvantages and advantages, but I do believe the advantages do weigh the negatives that come with having universal healthcare, since we're able to provide free healthcare that's of high quality to all patients regardless of who they are.
Station 5. Is it essential for doctors in the NHS to be knowledgeable of social care services in the UK?
So what we mean by social care services that are available for patients in the UK are things such as having daycare centres, nursing homes, there being particular support services for patients undergoing domestic abuse, children undergoing abuse at home as well. So there are a wide range of social care services that people can access and can be referred to by healthcare professionals. So yes, overall it's very important for doctors to be aware of the respective social support services that are available for patients that they can refer them onto, since it provides a very holistic care for them, since not only are doctors able to tackle the physical problems that the patient has, these nursing homes and support services that are specific to domestic abuse patients can help the patients post hospital as well and provide the right support for them after they've received all the medical side of things. Doctors being aware that these support systems exist also means that they can collaborate with the right healthcare staff, with the right services, and this all collates and adds on to providing the right care for the patient and improving the patient's overall outcomes as well. And finally, all of this altogether works towards tackling all the social determinants of health, things such as poverty, housing, finances, since these social support services are more tailored towards these aspects as opposed to the more medical side of things, which is what the doctors are faced with in the wards and what they tackle on the wards.
Station 6. Describe the organisational structure of the NHS.
So the organisational structure of the NHS is a bit complicated, however it can be split into two broad categories to describe how it is organised. The first category is how it's split into primary, secondary and tertiary care. The second category is the respective governmental groups and bodies that are in charge of financial and resource allocation as well. So when we're discussing primary care, for example, it's associated with the first point of contact for most patients, which is at their GP surgeries or at parts of A&E, for example. Secondary care is to do with the more specialties that we see at hospitals that patients go once they've gone past A&E, for example. This is where we see all the doctors who are consultants in their respective fields and where they provide patients with care on the wards or in clinics, for example. And finally, we have tertiary care, which is more specialised care that patients can receive for particular things such as if they need neurosurgery, for extensive burns and trauma. There's particular units across the UK for this. And finally, for patients with severe psychiatric problems, and there are particular institutions that come under tertiary care across the UK as well. So that's one side of how the NHS is structured. Another way is, again, all the different bodies in charge of resource allocation, for example. So we have NHS England, which does this for England, where it's responsible for the planning of how care is to be delivered and how resources are to be allocated across England as well. And then within that, you have the more regional level groups such as clinical care, clinical commissioning groups, and the integrated care systems that both work together to allocate resources and social care in different regions across the UK. And finally, you also have the more political figures such as the Health Secretary, for example, who's been newly elected, who's also has a say in where resources are allocated and how funding will work across the UK and across the next few years.
Station 7. Explain the advantages of multidisciplinary team approaches in the NHS.
So what we mean by having a multidisciplinary approach to, for example, a complex case, it means that you have a lot of different heads from different backgrounds working together to solve a problem, and whether that be having a lot of clinical consultants, advanced nurse practitioners, physiotherapists, nutritionists, all working together in the same room on the same case. And this has a lot of advantages, and the ones I'll be discussing relate to how it provides a very holistic care towards the patients involved. It leverages on the expertise of various professionals. It reduces the risk of any errors, and it facilitates enhanced coordination between healthcare professionals as well. So one of the biggest advantages is that it really leverages on the expertise of a lot of different professionals, and it means that they can tackle the problem more effectively as they can approach the same problem from a lot of different angles, and there can be a lot of different inputs being made on the same case. And since there are a lot of professionals working on the same complex case, that also means that we reduce the likelihood of making medical errors, since other staff members can double check, cross check on any treatments being made or any advice being given, which can lead to overall very effective care. And finally, having a multidisciplinary approach to cases, to a patient's health, also facilitates better coordination and communication between healthcare staff, and it can improve on these skills as well. So overall, I think that having a multidisciplinary approach to patients' care is very effective, and since it is so effective, it does get used very often from what I've seen in my work experience, where these teams sit down in meetings every now and again to discuss very complex cases and work on the best solution for them.
Station 8. Discuss the advantages and disadvantages of a hierarchical structure in the NHS workforce.
So within the NHS, there are a lot of hierarchical structures that different professions follow or have. So in terms of doctors, we usually have our junior doctors at the bottom, and then that goes up towards SHOs, residents, and finally consultants at the top level. And there are a lot of advantages and disadvantages that do come with having this kind of structure within an organisation. The main advantages are to do with there being very clear lines in terms of responsibility. It allows for oversight and monitoring. Finally, it also streamlines a pathway for career advancement and progression. The main disadvantages are to do with how it doesn't allow for flexibility, it can limit open communication, and it can also create power imbalances. In terms of advantages, it creates very clear lines for accountability and responsibility, which means that, for example, as a junior doctor, if you do have a particular concern, you know who to escalate it to, and this can be dealt with very effectively. Since there are different subgroups in charge of different things within the NHS because of these hierarchies, it allows us to monitor medical practices and outcomes, which improves the quality of care that we deliver overall. And finally, since we do have these hierarchies, it also streamlines pathway for specialisation, for example, very well. Since junior doctors, they know what the next step is in terms of their career very well. In terms of disadvantages, the main one is the lack of flexibility having these very rigid structures results in. This means that we can have slower response times when it comes to escalating particular concerns someone has, like particular concerns patients have, and this can be quite ineffective. Additionally, since these hierarchies tend to be very broad and it covers, if not hundreds, of different professionals at different levels, it can mean that they are unlikely to engage in open conversation regarding any particular ideas that they have, and these ideas are less likely to reach the decision makers higher up in the hierarchy as well. And finally, since there are very rigid lines between the people who have a lot more power in terms of decision making as to the people who don't, it can create power imbalances, which can, if abused, can have very negative consequences on an individual's morale, for example, or their emotional health as well. So overall, I think that although there are disadvantages, the advantages do outweigh them. And for the problems that we do have with these kind of structures, there are a lot of systems and strategies in place for people if they do arise, such as support for staff members or workers who face these kind of power imbalances.
Station 9. Why is evidence-based medicine considered a crucial approach for providing high-quality patient care?
So evidence-based medicine allows us to give treatments and procedures for patients that's based off of proven effectiveness. We're able to reduce the risk of giving the patient any unnecessary treatments or procedures, and finally we're able to deliver care that's of the highest quality and based off the most up-to-date recent evidence for the patient as well. So what we mean by evidence-based medicine is that we're practicing medicine that's based off the best literature regarding particular treatments, particular procedures, and that these procedures and treatments that we do give them are based off of the most proven effectiveness. This means that we enhance patient safety, but we also improve healthcare outcomes for the patients overall. Additionally, this also means that we reduce the risk that we carry by giving the patient unnecessary treatments, which means that they are less likely to have any complications due to these treatments that are less effective or that they don't need, again improving their overall patient outcomes as well. And finally, since evidence-based medicine means following guidelines regarding particular treatments, medications, etc., that's based off the most recent update literature, it means that we provide the highest quality of care for the patients.
Station 10. Explain whether you think the NHS is adequately funded, overfunded, or underfunded.
Currently, there are a lot of indicators which suggest that the NHS is actually underfunded. And the reason why I'm saying this is due to things such as the long waiting times we're seeing on the news, articles surrounding staff shortages, as well as the NHS's inability to tackle chronic conditions at the minute. Right now we're seeing very long waiting times for patients when accessing A&E. They're having to wait up to 6 to 8 hours simply just to see a doctor at a hospital, as well as even booking a GP appointment at their local GP surgery as well. It's taking several days for them to contact their surgery in the morning. And this suggests that there must be some sort of problem in terms of resource allocation in primary care. Additionally, we're also seeing staff shortages where a lot of staff, such as nurses and doctors, they're actually going abroad to find the same jobs but for a better pay, or we're seeing a lot of staff working privately to have extra money, which again shows that there may be some funding issues regarding the pay for these healthcare professionals. And finally, we're also seeing the NHS struggle with managing more chronic conditions that we're seeing in our elderly population, as our ageing population has definitely increased. However, the extra years they're spending alive aren't spent disability free. In fact, they have more chronic conditions, which we're seeing the NHS struggle with. So overall, all of these things indicate that the NHS is underfunded. However, that being said, there are a lot of things that are being done currently, and hopefully in the future too, by our new government, in order to tackle these problems in an effective way that still makes sure that healthcare is accessible to everyone.